This podcast is recorded primarily in Stratford, Ontario. Stratford is on the territory of the Anishinaabe-Wakim, Atitawanderunk Neutral, and Mississauga's land. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, notably the Huron Tract Purchase. This new business acknowledges this history of the land and strives to be an ally to the Indigenous peoples of Canada, who have suffered through systemic racism, causing intergenerational trauma. I urge you to be aware of the path of truth and reconciliation that is ongoing in this country, which was fought for in the largest class action lawsuit against the Canadian federal government. Stemming from this lawsuit, thousands of children have been discovered buried at residential schools, the last of which closed in 1996. This podcast is not sponsored yet. It's in its infancy, pure and yet to be monetized. Regardless, I promise to never allow ads to detract from the fantasy football fun and analysis on the show. If you're listening and you have a business in need of advertising, maybe you should consider a new and meteoric rising podcast. To settle and assuage any doubts, here's a sample. Did you know that 1 in every 4 Canadians suffer from one of the many devastating symptoms of goose-related mania? These sassy and hissing wonders of the water are quite grumpy, as I can personally attest to, and are responsible for the raised heart rates of millions of Ontarians this year already. Not for long, though. For the low, discounted price of $9.99 plus tax, this will no longer be a source of stress in your life. With no loose goose, spritz and spray. Spray it on yourself, and your goose invisible. Spray it in front of you, the goose will cease hissing with amazement, losing interest. I do not advertise for products I do not endorse, O Nation, and no loose goose has the O-Dog verbal stamp of approval. O-Dog out. Before we jump in, please review and follow this podcast on your podcast service. Select that little plus button at the top of your phone to follow, and then scroll down a little bit to leave a rating and a review. That'd be swell. And if you have some fun with your review, I'll even read it on the podcast. In the future, being a follower, rater, and reviewer may just earn you a free signed jersey. Stay tuned. Also on that topic, please like and follow this podcast on Facebook, 1&0 Fantasy Football, or at 1&0 Fantasy Football. Also on Twitter, at 1&0 Fantasy, and on Instagram, at 1&0 Fantasy Football. Note, 1&0 is not 1&0 with an OH. It's 1&0 with just the O, and that's me. I'll pause here for a moment and wait for you to like and follow on the socials. Did you do it? You know that there's a pause button right there, right? Yeah, I wasn't joking. I'll wait.
And bonjour. You're listening to the official 1&0 Fantasy Football Podcast. It's time to join your host, the commissioner extraordinaire, the fantasy football trademonger, Owen O-Dog Drake.
Welcome to 1&0 Fantasy Football, where you're the 1 and I'm the O. Today, the 1 will also be Mr. Joel Terhaerdt, a new addition to my league of record, but an old friend from my childhood. He'll be the first guest on the new segment, The Commish Chair, where we discuss the end of the season choice that was made to play Cooper Kupp instead of benching him for a more optimal playoff matchup. This one is bound to be an enjoyable discussion, as I know his decision changed the history of the league of record, and had he made the opposite decision, could have earned him a championship in his inaugural season. After the conclusion of this interview, we'll shift gears to a fantasy discussion regarding the recent trade of Davante Adams to the Las Vegas Raiders and the Allen Robinson signing for the Los Angeles Rams, which led to another trade. This is yet another episode that will be lengthy due to the fantasy football anguish I'm asking Joel to relive and the seismic moves that the NFL seems keen to continue in this historic offseason. At this point, I'm accepting the average of 1 hour and 30 minutes for this and the next few episodes. Oh, look, we got a special guest coming in. He's coming in hot. Hey, Joel.
Hey, Owen, how's it going?
It's going well. Glad to have you on the pod here, Joel, but you need a proper introduction. Hit it. Introducing the other half of the vaunted OJ penalty kill line with me on our Stratford travel hockey team. A new addition to our league of record last year, bringing his Wolf of Waller Street squad all the way to a 5th place finish. He studied robotics and automation mechanical engineering at Conestoga College and is now a volunteer firefighter. The man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Joel Terhaerdt. Joel, how the hell are you?
I'm doing just fine, Owen. Happy to be here and talk some fantasy football.
Woo! Amen to that.
Yeah, and maybe not so much of kind of the events that had taken place at the end of last season, but it's a learning point, that's for sure.
And definitely a point of discussion for our league in the coming league meeting that we inevitably have every offseason. But Joel, before we begin, where can listeners find you on the socials and what kind of content can people expect?
Well, I have a Facebook and an Instagram. I wouldn't expect much on there as far as content. Still trying to get to 1 post a year, but you can find me there. I also have a side business starting up this year, so I'll soon have a website and socials for that coming soon.
Awesome. Well, yeah, you did mention that we likely wouldn't be following you on the socials, but it's great. We'll get that plug in for your new business on your inevitable return to the podcast.
Thank you.
What is the new business, Joel?
We are in wholesaling for roofing products that consist of covered patios, decks, screen rooms, and sunrooms. So in wholesaling.
Awesome. So yeah, if you're here in Ontario and you need any of those products, you know who your man is.
I'm the guy.
Okay. So listeners, you'll notice that I brought in Joel before I hit my preamble for our topics of the day. The fallout for the Packers and the Raiders from the Davante Adams shocker, as well as the fallout for the Rams and the Titans from the Allen Robinson signing and Robert Woods being traded thereafter. This is because we have an important topic to discuss, one that centers around league integrity, if that's the correct term.
The commish chair.
This is a tale of woe and possibly regret for my guest today, and I'm pumped to dig into it. I'm pumped because there's nothing better for content than pain. This is relatable pain. This is fantasy football decision pain. To understand the context of Joel's pain, we rewind back to before the 2021 fantasy football season. Prior to the 2021 fantasy season, my league of record is attempting to replace a league manager, as well as add 2 more managers. We had 12 managers the year prior, but one retired from our league to pursue other interests, and another wasn't asked to return. So we needed to add 3 managers to get to our goal. Enter Joel and 2 other new recruits, all of which had excellent seasons. Shout out to James and Michael as well as Joel here. So this raises an important point. Are you stuck in a league with disinterested and unengaged managers? Remove them. Replace them. Fantasy football can be the most fun activity or something that just passes you by. A league is only as good as its managers, and there's glaring attention placed on those that are the least involved. So Joel was placed in a division with myself, Fusco, who y'all heard on the most recent episode, and Chris. The divisions were organized by past success in terms of wins and losses in our, at the time, 8-year-old league heading into our 9th year. So, fast forwarding through the season, I entered week 14 on a 7-game win streak at 8-5. Don't calculate back before the 7-game win streak. And Joel entered the week also at 8-5. Through some calculations and forecasting, Joel and I separately both came to the same conclusion. If he won, he would have to play me and my monster of a team in the quarterfinals. And if he lost, he would have to play Dimitri, who had a good year in his own right, but was dealing with substantial injuries at the time and at 7-7 had squeaked into the playoff position due to his weak division. Since we're in the commish chair segment here, it's important to note that this was our first year with divisions. And honestly, I loved it from both commish and manager perspective. What we do with aligning the divisions going forward is up to the league in terms of a vote. But I like that it mirrors the actual NFL, where there may be a weak division winner every year, but it still includes 3 wild cards where the best teams still qualify. So, entering week 14, Joel messages me and says, actually, I think I might get 6th if I lose. A lot of points for Dylan, another manager, and that'll put me into 6th, all caps, and line me up with Dimitri for the playoffs. Fast forward to midway through the Sunday night game this week where I get the message, bye-bye, Cup, followed by, he's a bench boy now, after I questioned the message. This was in reference to Joel's team currently losing to my own, which he said, and I've outlined, would lead him to a more optimal playoff matchup for the quarterfinals a week later. Later that night, the message, it's done, essentially put a wrap on the decision whether Joel would play or not to play Cooper Cup. After these messages, I said, we may have to talk about full lineups in the offseason. Don't get me wrong, great move. Others have done it. My dad pulled that move this year with a defense for a win, and I've definitely done that before too. I just think we're going to have to discuss a rule or at least have the discussion about this and float it out there in the offseason to the other managers. Joel was cool with this, and I floated a bit of a thinker of a message afterwards that said, I quote, it's surprising that you'd rather go against Dalvin Cook, Leonard Fournette, and Aaron Jones, referencing Dimitri's team. All of this led to the now iconic message the following day from Joel, quote, I'm letting the fantasy gods decide my fate tonight. Plus, I'll take the off chance of beating you twice in 1 year. Famous last words. Joel, would you care to lead me through what occurred next?
Well, there was a lot of pain, Owen. A lot of pain. Now, yeah, like you said, it all started back in week 14, last week of the regular season. We were fortunate enough where we both had players still playing a Monday night football game. So I had a bit of time to think about it Sunday night, if I would want to start Cup, sit Cup. And I know the message sent by you about Dalvin Cook, Leonard Fournette, and Aaron Jones, I think that got to the best of me. But made the decision to start Cup. Like I said, let the fantasy gods decide. And in the end, wrong decision, because the week after, I'm lined up with yours truly, O-Dog, and get absolutely pumped, 157 to 114. But if we look at that score, Dimitri only put up 108 points against his matchup. And if I would have lost to Owen the week prior, I would have been matched up with Dimitri and ended up winning. Then if we take it the next round further, I believe I would have been paired up with Anthony. And I was on a bye for my consolation side now. And I managed to get 148 points that week. And that's without me starting Damian Harris with 31 points on my bench. And Anthony only pulling up 113 points. So I would have snuck through there too. we take it one more further to the championship week where we had Owen and Dimitri in the finals. Owen putting up a scouring 156 points with Dimitri's 92, where I put up an amazing, for my team, 162 points. So a lot of pain there if we look back on it at, wow, I could have won. But in the end, the fantasy gods did not want that to happen.
No, the fantasy gods favored yours truly in the end there. And actually, if we rewind even further, you weren't in the league for this at the time, and we'll definitely talk more about this over the off season. But there was and throughout the season, but there was a point in the previous season where my team, as well assembled as it wasn't performing that well, was near the bottom of the league. So I traded pretty much everyone away, did a huge fire sale. And that's how my monster of a team this year was assembled. And I can understand why at that point you would have rather been matched up against Dimitri. And as you perfectly outlined, you would have squeaked past Dimitri, if we can call it that, by 6 points. Bit more than a squeak, but we'll call it that, in the first week.
Oh, we'll talk about a squeak here on the next week matchup.
Yeah, and then the semifinals. So my dad and Anthony come back from their bye, and in the nail biter of all nail biters, I squeak out against my dad by 1.2 points. Now, you're right. That's the squeak. And I don't think you would have been matched up against him, because I believe that would have made you the bottom seed and then Anthony, the top seed. So that would have matched you up against Anthony. And no matter what, Anthony, if you're listening to this, just make sure that you know that you were destined for that first round exit after your bye, no matter what. So regardless, it would have been me or Joel eliminating Anthony, leading to an Owen Joel championship where Joel would have emerged victorious. Now, as a bit of a note and a disclaimer, I guess, the pressure's off once you're eliminated from the playoffs. Week 16, you've put up 148 points. Would it have been? Would it not have been? I think that one is the week that we can say for certain that you would have been at least higher than both myself, my dad, Anthony. Definitely higher than 140 points, where you put up 148, like you said, without Damian Harris, and had Devonta Freeman and Mike Davis still in your lineup from the previous week, where they would have had better matchups that week. And then, as you said, the heartbreaker of all heartbreakers. So, I mean, if it's me, I can deal with the 1 week where it's like, okay, yeah, I would have won the next week. That's cool. But then.
Yes, it's a compounding pain, if we want to say it that way. Yes, Owen.
You heard it here first, folks. The first ever compounding pain. Oh, okay. So that leads me into my question. So looking back, would you make the same decision again?
Looking back, I would probably make the same decision. I'm a very competitive guy. I was playing Owen, so I want to beat Owen. This is my first year in the league, trying to put up as much points as I can. I know we track that sort of stuff, and I'm not going to turn down a chance to beat the commissioner here twice in 1 year.
That was actually a point of contention for me too. I was not happy that a new recruit comes in and kind of smacks me around during the regular season, but I mean, it all worked out in the end. But yeah, I mean, Joel's competitiveness and integrity is a strong word, and that's why I hesitated to include it there. Like, it's a game. At the end of the day, I respect your decision if you're going to put him in, or if you're not going to, or if you're going to take him out. You had the opportunity to pick your own poison. And like I said, I pointed out that you could go against this 3-pack of running backs, but neglected to point out that you would have had to go against my 3-pack of wide receivers and, Jonathan Taylor and Elijah Mitchell. So, I mean, yeah.
No, and that's where I think having that option to make this decision is important, because opportunities like this present itself, and you have to dig through the scenarios, sort out what would work out best for you and your team, and make that decision. So I think how we have our league is good, and we have that option to make that, but definitely a talking point in the future, and for everybody listening, for your leagues.
Yeah, absolutely. And as our sort of professional, if we can call it that, recommendation based on this topic, I think it could have just as easily gone the other way. Joel throws his last week matchup, gets matched up against Dimitri, and Dimitri's team goes off, and he's left wondering, what could have been if he could have beat me in that first week. And judging by the stats, he could have, but in the opposite fashion, it could have gone, in the opposite direction. So in your mind, Joel, what does the league do in the future?
Well, I think all we really can do is have a group discussion and outline kind of what should happen in these scenarios. Do we allow an empty roster spot, or do we require it to be filled by a starting player? Now there's some options there too. You put in someone who is not going to put up good numbers for there. But I think as long as everybody is aware of the rule, I think that's the best case scenario here, and the way we have it, I think is probably the best.
Yeah, and I'm definitely inclined to agree. I thought a lot about this since it occurred, and I think there's a very big difference between intentionally sitting a player in a week to affect playoff seeding as opposed to a negligent manager.
Right, and I think that's where having that discussion with you prior to this, making sure I was not aware of rules prior and wanted to make sure, but making sure somebody is aware of kind of the strategy you're putting forth.
Absolutely. And I mean, as long as we have, like you said, as long as we have this discussion throughout the off season, then I think at the end of the day, whether you're investing thousands of dollars, hundreds of dollars, even $10 in your local home league into a league, or even if it's just for bragging rights, at the end of the day, fantasy football is a game, and those that play the game and know the ins and outs of the game and its loopholes, I believe you brought up in our previous recording of this, you should be able to take advantage of that. You should be able to play the game to the best way possible. You said it best. You putting the decision up to the fantasy gods could go one way, it could go the other way, but we actually ended up with some great content based off of the pain that occurred from just the almost fantasy football championship.
It would have been bittersweet. That's for sure.
I don't know, man. I think you could have stood by that decision, and I don't think anybody would have said anything too much of it. But yeah. Joel, before we get out of the commish chair here, any last thoughts on the pain and the missed opportunities?
Things like this happen. Yeah, it's tough when these things happen. You have to do your research, own your decision. Don't let others sort of influence. But it definitely stung for, I guess that was another 3 weeks as this dragged on from that initial decision. So there was a lot of pain there for a while.
Absolutely. And if I could leave this on one thought as well, when somebody reaches out to you and says that they are going to make this decision, you should do everything in your power, if you believe it is the right decision for them, but not for you, to try and influence them the opposite way. Point out the strengths on the other team that they are choosing, and that could lead to your fantasy football championship, just like yours truly.
Thank you, Owen.
Okay, let's hit the preamble.
Raider Devontae and A-Rob forces Woods to Tennessee.
First, Davante Adams. To understand the gravity of trading Davante Adams, let's rewind back to the 2014 draft, the last time the Packers took a receiver within the first 3 rounds. With the 53rd pick of the second round of the 2014 NFL Draft, the Green Bay Packers select Davante Adams out of Fresno State. Now, he wasn't the Davante you know and love during his early years in the league. In 2014, as a rookie, he failed the top 500 receiving yards as Aaron Rodgers passed for over 1,200 yards to Randall Cobb and over 1,500 yards to Jordy Nelson, per Pro Football Reference. This makes sense due to the domination by Cobb and Nelson, that is, Adams' production. But in 2015, this trend continued. Jordy Nelson was out for the season due to a knee injury, and apparently he was the Jenga piece of the Packers offense, as not a single receiver topped 900 yards receiving, including Adams, who yet again failed to surpass even 500 yards. In 2016, Jordy Nelson returned and churned out another 1,200-yard plus receiving season, and Adams improved, but at 997 yards, failed to eclipse the 1,000-yard mark for the third consecutive year, which would even be continued into his fourth year, where he failed to even reach 900 yards receiving. Failing to reach this 1,000-yard receiving mark in the 4 beginning years of a receiver's career is a death knell for their careers, especially with an all-world quarterback at the helm. 2018, though, was the explosion year that not many in the fantasy space saw coming. Yes, there's always reason to draft receivers attached to Aaron Rodgers, but due to the reasons I've outlined, he wasn't a hot commodity. Adams responded to this with 111 receptions on 169 targets with over 1,300 yards receiving and 13 touchdowns, finishing, per Fantasy Pros, in half-point PPR as the wide receiver 3 behind Tyreek Hill and DeAndre Hopkins. Thus began the 4-year stretch from 2018 to 2021, where Adams was consistently within the upper echelon of NFL and fantasy wide receivers, where in 2020 and 2021, he was also named a first-team wide receiver All-Pro, notably finishing as the wide receiver 1 in fantasy in 2020 and the wide receiver 2 overall in 2021. Prior to the 2021 season, however, Adams was hankering for an extension heading into the final year of his contract, and drama surrounded the Packers as Aaron Rodgers butted heads with general manager Brian Gutekunst. This would lead to Rodgers' return with a new contract that allowed him an out after the season, Randall Cobb's return through a trade, and to Rodgers and Adams tweeting out identical images from Michael Jordan's Last Dance documentary, implying that the 2021-2022 season would be their last ride together. The season concluded, as it is prone to in the Rodgers era, with a loss in the divisional round, leaving fans of the Packers and the NFL alike wondering if they'd see Rodgers in a Packers uniform again. Rodgers ultimately decided to return to the Packers for the 2022 season, and Davante Adams was franchise tagged. We all assumed we would see the Rodgers-Adams connection once again. Later, news broke that Davante Adams refused to play under the franchise tag and that both sides were still working towards a long-term deal. This is for naught, however, as Adams was shockingly traded to the Las Vegas Raiders for a first and a second-round pick in the 2022 NFL Draft. Moving to a lower tier of receiver for a moment, let's catch you up on the careers of Allen Robinson and Robert Woods during this preamble. Beginning with Robert Woods, Woods, like Adams, was a second-round pick at 41st overall. He was selected by the Buffalo Bills the year prior to Adams in the 2013 NFL Draft. Fun fact, per Pro Football Reference, his nickname is Bobby Trees. Get it? Woods' talents were wasted in Buffalo for 4 years, totaling less than 700 yards yearly and never topping 5 touchdowns as he suffered through quarterbacks E.J. Manuel, Thaddeus Lewis, Kyle Orton, Tyrod Taylor, Matt Castle, and Cardale Jones, making him completely unusable and irrelevant for fantasy football. Woods' second season also marked the arrival of fellow receiver Sammy Watkins, with whom he'd compete for targets with for 3 years. Woods was not fantasy relevant at all during this time, as even the hyper-targeted Watkins suffered from that trash heap of quarterbacks. But his skill set of short to medium routes could even be seen to the inexperienced eye during this time. With the Rams was where Woods truly broke out. His partnership with Jared Goff, Cooper Kupp, and Sean McVay would pay huge dividends. Even with the presence of Brandon Cooks in 2018 and 2019, Bobby Trees would nearly total 800 yards in his first year, followed by over 1,100 yards in the following 2 years, and finally over 900 yards in 2020. 2021 marked Woods' final season with the Rams as he totaled almost 600 yards in 9 games before tearing his ACL. Now, returning to fantasy, per Fantasy Pros in half-point PPR, Woods' top fantasy finishes included wide receiver 10th overall in 2018, wide receiver 17 overall in 2019, and wide receiver 13 in 2020. The Los Angeles Rams would sign Odell Beckham Jr. mid-season after his release from the Browns and would culminate their Woodsless season with a Super Bowl victory. They then signed Allen Robinson at the opening of free agency in the current 2022 offseason, which spelled the end of Robert Woods' time with the Rams, as then he was traded to the Tennessee Titans for a 2023 sixth-round pick. Speaking of Allen Robinson, his tale is also one of quarterback and fantasy woe, even more so than Woods for the most part. Robinson was also a second-round pick of the 2014 NFL draft, like Adams, drafted 61st overall to the Jacksonville Jaguars. His first year in the NFL wasn't fantasy relevant as he went for nearly 600 yards and 2 touchdowns, but his second year is the one that to this day still has fantasy players salivating. Per Fantasy Pros and half-point PPR, Allen Robinson finished as the wide receiver 6 overall with over 1,400 yards and 14 touchdowns to his name on only 80 catches. Talk about catch efficiency. More notable than the wide receiver 6 overall as a sophomore was the fact that this was accomplished with none other than Blake Bortles at quarterback. Robinson returned to earth the following year, failing to top 900 yards as Bortles floundered. And the following year in 2016, he tore his ACL and missed the season after 1 catch for 17 yards. Thus would end Robinson's time in Jacksonville as he was signed to Chicago during free agency. His prize at quarterback with the Bears was sophomore Mitchell Trubisky. This is ironic as Trubisky was the second coming of Blake Bortles, exciting a fan base as a high first-round pick, then inevitably flaming out with the team as questions of inaccuracy mounted. Robinson would finish as wide receiver 41 his first year in Chicago, but followed this finish with 2 years of over 1,100 yards and 6 touchdowns in 2019 and 2020, finishing as the wide receiver 11 and wide receiver 12 in these years respectively. This is what fantasy players had come to expect, as even the Bears flip-flopping between Nick Foles and Trubisky couldn't slow him down. Turns out he could be slowed, with what many think of as a business decision occurred in 2021, as during Matt Nagy's last season as head coach and Justin Fields' first season at Bears quarterback, combined with the emergence of late-round pick Darnell Mooney as both an NFL and fantasy gem, Allen Robinson would finish at wide receiver 88 with just over 400 yards and only 1 touchdown. This season, Allen Robinson has seemingly finally found his savior quarterback as the Los Angeles Rams scorned the recovery of Robert Woods and Odell Beckham Jr.'s ACLs and signed Robinson to be their big-bodied ex-receiver, second to Cooper Kupp for 3 years and $46 million. So, with the unusual format of today's interview and after the conclusion of that preamble, let's bring Joel back in. Welcome back, Joel.
Happy to be here again.
So, Joel, Davante Adams is traded to the Raiders. This reunites Adams with his college quarterback in Derek Carr and fills a long empty spot at X receiver for the Raiders to be the number 1 receiver to Hunter Renfro's number 2 in the slot. He's traded for a first and a second rounder, as I mentioned. So, Joel, let's begin initial reaction to the compensation that the Raiders gave up for Adams, as well as initial reactions to the Packers trading him away and the Raiders acquiring him.
Absolutely. Well, I think like most, this came to me as a complete surprise. And when I dove into it for a first and second round, yes, I would take that. So I believe the Raiders came out well ahead here. And it leaves a more interesting scenario out in Green Bay right now.
I completely agree. And we're going to get into the fantasy implications for the Green Bay Packers and for the Las Vegas Raiders. But returning back to initial reactions, you're right. I think the compensation was probably right on the money. First and a second round pick is a high amount of draft capital to give up for a wide receiver, but this is debatably the best wide receiver in the NFL. Notably, Davante Adams grew up a Raiders fan. And immediately after coming in, he signs a new deal with the Raiders that pays him $141 million over the next 5 years, averages an annual value of $28 million. It's the richest deal for a wide receiver in history. And this would prove to be a domino for Tyreek Hill's exit from the Chiefs, as it set a new benchmark.
Yeah, I didn't know Davante Adams and Carr had this relationship, so it kind of flew under my radar. But this checks a lot of boxes for Davante Adams, and it's going to be interesting to see what he brings to that team, as they didn't truly have an ex receiver there on their core.
Absolutely. He seems like the perfect complement to the Carr, Renfro, Waller sort of offense the Raiders got going on there. And
yeah,
it's definitely great for new head coach Josh McDaniels. And my anger stems at Josh McDaniels stems from the fact that I'm famously a Colts fan, but he agreed to be the Colts' new head coach a few years ago and backed out at the last minute. So forever to me, Josh McDaniels is a coach that is dead to me in the NFL.
Yeah, it definitely was a surprise that he backed out so last minute there.
Yeah, and I think that cost him a couple of coaching opportunities for the years after that decision. But I guess it's a new opportunity for him and an opportunity for him to improve on the failed experience of him coaching the Denver Broncos. Also,
yes, definitely going to be an exciting turn of events there for that team.
Also important to note, Aaron Rodgers was allegedly aware that Adams wouldn't be playing for the Pack in 2022 when he signed his new deal. This seems kind of like false news to me, Joel.
Yeah, I'm not believing everything I'm hearing on that one. I can't see Aaron Rodgers still wanting to kick around in Green Bay with his number one option and a bromance that they've had for quite a bit gone, because looking at that team right now, it's stretched pretty thin.
Yeah, and as a closing note on the initial reactions, apparently Adams also turned down more money to go play for his childhood team and his college quarterback and to leave. I mean, maybe that's a part of it too. He wanted to leave the Rodgers experience behind.
Right. And I always thought those two were close, but maybe there's something else we don't really know there.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe you could look at it through the lens of he understands Rodgers' talent, but he's accomplished all that he can. And like I said in the preamble, it seems like the Packers keep making these divisional or conference round exits from the playoffs. And while Carr might not be a better quarterback, he couldn't pass off this opportunity at the time. And maybe he could be that piece that puts the Raiders over the top and allows them to get deep into the playoffs and maybe deeper than the Packers ever could.
Right. Like they've had arguably the best quarterback over the last few years and arguably one of the best wide receivers over the last few years and no championships to show for it. So maybe this just was the breaking point for Davante and things needed to change.
Absolutely.
And reuniting with Carr is definitely not a bad place to go.
And I mean, that's akin to the Bengals bring in last year. They bring in Jamar Chase, who's matched up with his college quarterback in Joe Burrow. So, I mean, the NFL is a copycat league, and maybe he saw that, and it's been a few years, but I don't think that chemistry ever goes away.
No, it's going to be there for the long haul.
Now, for a moment, let's turn our attention back to the Pack. In our previous episode, Fusk and I discussed the Packers fantasy players, but all of that seems gone out the window. Joel, how do the Adams-less Packers look to you from a fantasy football perspective?
I'm still trying to find someone I want on my team on that list. Besides Aaron, and even now, where is he going to go? Lazard? So I think there's a lot of key things that need to happen over these next few weeks, and that I foresee happening with maybe some free agent signings or another trade. But at first glance, this team is not looking sharp.
No, it doesn't look like a fantasy football offense you really want a part of. So Rodgers can't be happy, even if he knew that Adams wasn't going to play for them. He couldn't have also foreseen that Marquez Valdes-Scantling leaves the team too to replace Tyreek in Kansas City. And as you mentioned, now we're down to just Allen Lazard, who notably also a restricted free agent. He was given a second round tender by the team, which means that he could be signed by another team, but it would cost that team a second round pick. He's definitely a favorite of Rodgers and will be back with the team, presumably, as you mentioned, as their wide receiver one. You got Randall Cobb. He's continuing to man the slot. At tight end, Robert Tonyan was just resigned as his 2021 season ended prematurely with an ACL tear around halfway last year. Any of those names interest you?
Yeah, Tonyan coming back, he can do some damage, but coming off of an injury leaves a lot of question to be what kind of player will he be when he comes back. Now, a couple weapons that they still have, I guess, would be their running back core, and it's a good one, probably one of the best duos, and they're going to have to be picking up some slack here on the receiving side of things, just because of that void that they have now in the wide receiver core.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at first glance, this Packers offense kind of looks like hands off for fantasy, but the more that I've delved into it, it could create a boon of value for the rest of the players. So let's break this down. You've got Lazard. Let's put him at X. He might not be the perfect he's not a one-to-one replacement for Davante Adams. Then you got Cobb in the slot. And then, like you said, maybe they trade for somebody. That seems unlikely at this point. Maybe they'll use that draft capital to pick up another receiver in this draft class, which is notably deep at the receiver position. And they do have 2 first and 2 second round picks from this Adams deal, but it appears that the big bodied receivers akin to Davante Adams are far and few in between, even in this deep draft class. I was unable to find the tweet, but there's only 3 receivers in the whole of this class that are comparable to Adams. So maybe they bring in a field stretcher, somebody very fast, just like Marquez Valdes-Scantling, maybe Will Fuller at a cheap deal to stretch the field. And then you have Lazard on the other side. You have Cobb in the slot. And then, like you said, you have Aaron Jones and AJ Dillon in the backfield. Surprisingly for Dillon, who's just this huge hulking back, almost the same size as Derrick Henry, they're very capable pass catchers. This news should raise their values. Jones finished 7th in running back catches last year with 52 catches, and Dillon surprisingly nabbed 34 of his own.
Yeah, definitely a strong backfield there. And yeah, I think even Jones was 2nd in receiving yards, only behind Kamara. So he's got the potential to fill a receiving core void, but some fantasy implications there with Dillon and Jones is now you have 2 solid guys. How are they going to play this? I don't see it being a true 50-50 split with Jones coming out ahead on that side. But I think some of their team systems are going to be taking a change here this season.
Absolutely. So now we're, instead of maybe a high-powered launch the ball to Davante Adams on every play style offense, you've got both of these pass-catching backs, debatably, both of these backs mixing in to getting more passes. And I think that raises the value of Jones. I think that raises the value of Dillon. And especially when we're talking about forthcoming fantasy football drafts, whichever one of these is coming later, and I would presume that to be AJ Dillon, I think that raises his value significantly. And I think that makes it a huge draft day value for you, all of you as the listeners, as the O Nation, to grab Dillon and maybe even be a week-to-week starter as a backup, technically on his team, a backup running back.
Yeah, and with the amount of running back injuries we saw last year, it's definitely not a bad play to do. Me personally, I had a Tony Pollard on my team for Zeke when he goes down. So those backup roles can be key to getting you those midseason week wins.
Absolutely. And if you're going 0 RB, you're loading up on those wide receivers in the first rounds. That could be a later running back that sustains value. And like you said, could be a running back a top 5 running back should Aaron Jones get injured. And then shifting gears slightly to tight ends. So you've got Kelsey, you've got Andrews, you've got Waller and Kittle. Those are probably that top echelon of tight ends. But after those, I mean, Joel, are you more like you mentioned that Tunyon's coming back from the injury, and that's a bit of a downgrade for sure. But would you want Tonyan or Pitts, Tonyan or Goddard, Dawson Knox, Zach Ertz, Gronk?
Yeah, me personally, I don't have Tonyan too far up on my draft board here, but with this offense now, he's going to need to be a bigger part on this offense. But I don't think he's going to have a year where he can compete with, let's say, some of the middle guys here, Freiermuth, and if Gronk comes back. So I don't see him putting up the kind of numbers where he can make your roster on a week-to-week basis.
Yeah, and I think that's the the part of the tight end position. So I think we've listed probably about 9-10 tight ends here. So if you miss out on those top 10, I think the major takeaway from a fantasy football perspective is that you can still feel relatively comfortable should you have the 11th or 12th best tight end if you draft Robert Tonyan, because at that point, all you're hoping for each week is a touchdown, and Tonyan with Rodgers is probably one of the safer bets out of the remaining crop.
Rodgers does find the way into the end zone, and that void needs to be filled, and maybe they pick up on that tight end spot a little bit more now in the coming year. But I do find there's a lot of tight ends on the upper side, but I found myself with a couple tight ends on my team and going by the matchup routes. So wouldn't hurt to have them on your team, but I would think there's going to need to be somebody else there as well.
For sure. So turning our attention back to the receivers, I think you looked for the Packers to add one wide receiver in rounds 1 or 2. The Packers are going to draft a wide receiver in the top 3 rounds.
Unheard of.
So, and then I think they would also draft another one later. As usual, they usually like to draft one in the 5th, 6th, 7th round. So you got Lazard, you got Cobb, you got a rookie. You got Tonyan. We've talked Tonyan to death at this point. So I'm going to take a stab at this one first here. Personally, I'm going to take Lazard. His price might get out of control. So this is all average draft position or just draft position dependent. But a rookie draft pick, an early one, may excite all of the fantasy managers that don't listen to a fantasy football podcast at this point in the off season. They all get excited by this rookie. And as a note, don't draft the rookie. Regardless of if Rodgers loves this new incoming rookie wide receivers are a wasted draft pick if they're not named Jamar Chase historically. So take Lazard, especially if he's within those mid to late rounds. If it's after round 8, take your guy. If you believe that Lazard is going to absorb all of these targets, then you should absolutely pick him up. And Lazard has been a usable fantasy asset in the past.
Yeah, someone has to swallow those touchdowns that Rodgers is going to inevitably be throwing. So Lazard would be the number one option there, rather than Cobb. But both will be picking up heavy slack from the void now filled by Devontae Adams leaving.
Absolutely. So to put a bow on that one, Lazard in the later rounds, if you believe, shoot your shot, but do not jump the gun. You don't need to draft him during the top 5 rounds, in my opinion, because you don't know. It could be the Cobb show. It could be the Tonyan show. most likely, let's say we're leaning towards Lazard, but let's see how the rest of this offseason goes.
Yeah, it's going to be a key to be watching week 1 on this one to see what direction that offense is going to be taking.
Absolutely. And maybe even after week 1, if he has a huge boom, you trade him.
Yeah, get the value while you can.
Exactly. There's got to be one Aaron Rodgers aficionado in your league. Send Lazard over there, and you're feeling pretty good with the compensation that you can get. So next, the Las Vegas Raiders. Davante Adams enters a wide receiver room devoid of the disgraced first-round pick Henry Ruggs, and hopes to bring balance to an offense with Derek Carr, Hunter Renfrow, Darren Waller, Josh Jacobs, Kenyon Drake. Joel, how are you liking the Adams edition for the Raiders through a fantasy football lens?
This is everything that team needed. There was a substantial void for a primary on that team, and I'm invested on this team. Last year, I think I stacked Carr, Waller in there for the first couple weeks. Ultimately, ended up getting rid of Carr, and Waller didn't have the best season with some injuries and wasn't playing too good.
Joel, I got to tell you too, it was not an enjoyable experience losing to a team with Derek Carr on it, but the Carr-Waller stack for at least a few weeks during the season really, really paid you dividends.
Oh yes, and I hadn't gone that road before with stacking tight ends. I've done it with wide receivers, but if you look at that team, Waller was their number one option in my mind. There was no one else to go to. Hunter Renfrow picked up late, but he was their primary option going forward. So having Davante Adams go in there and fill that void, a much needed position player, this offense is going to be putting up some numbers.
Yeah, and personally, I love it too. I think he's still going to be near the top of the NFL in targets, which means thumbs up for fantasy. But there's obviously a downgraded at quarterback, moving from Rodgers to Carr. A quarterback influences his receivers more than a receiver influences a quarterback. For myself, for fantasy, this moves Adams below Cooper Kupp, where you could make an argument for either one of them before this move. But he still remains above Debo with the uncertainty of Trey Lance, above Tyreek after his trade to the Dolphins. So, Joel, let's run through some names here. I'm going to call this game Adams or.
Yeah, I actually have Adams bumping down to 5 on my list. So,
ooh, this is going to make this a fun game.
Yes. So I have Cooper Kupp at a solid 1, and I have a little bias there. Had him last year.
Okay, so Adams or Kupp? It's Kupp. Adams or Tyreek?
Adams. So I have Tyreek at 6.
Tyreek at 6. Okay. Adams or Debo?
Debo.
Okay, let's chain this up. So yeah, run me through your top 5. Who we got above Adams now?
All right, so my top 5 would be Cooper Kupp. Then we have Justin Jefferson.
Ooh.
I have him shot up. And then Debo. Then Jamar. Then Davante Adams. And then Tyreek Hill.
Okay, so then for context, you're saying Adams over Diggs, Keenan Allen, CeeDee Lamb. I think that all makes sense. And above Tyreek, I think that all makes relative sense. Although I would put Adams still up at number 2, but I'm interested. So Adams over Jefferson. Talk to me through that.
Yeah, well, this is strictly just because there's still a bit of a wild card here moving to the Raiders. Familiar with Carr, yes. Different systems. Who knows how he's going to fit in? They aren't used to having that primary receiver or so-called safety blanket of a receiver where they used to just ditch it off to the tight ends. But with Justin Jefferson, I think he's going to have another star-studded season this year, and the combo of Adam Thielen and Jefferson, where you got to choose one, he's going to do well as well.
Now, I reminded Anthony, so I think this is the perfect spot to remind you as well. Who owns Justin Jefferson in our league?
Yeah. I know who owns Justin Jefferson.
But actually, this past week, I did have some keeper anxiety, let's call it, where Tyreek Hill gets traded and it's like, oh no. Okay, Jonathan Taylor's locked in as my first keeper. Our league has 3. So Jonathan Taylor's locked in. That's an easy decision. Now it becomes Christian McCaffrey, Justin Jefferson, and Travis Kelce. And with Tyreek Hill leaving, I think Kelce might have to slot back up in, and I think Jefferson might have to still stay. So I think that would put McCaffrey on the block.
Yeah, luckily for myself, I'm not anywhere near the decision-making scenarios that you have. I'm struggling to find 3. So
there might be a future trade in there because, like you said, your potential keeper of DK Metcalf, that's not looking too good after the offseason deal of Russell Wilson to the Broncos.
No, and it definitely took a hit on his stock. That is for sure.
Okay, so let's return back to the Raiders. So we're saying Renfrow is still operating in the slot. That's great. I think he's still going to have fantasy value, but I think it's more of a bench player to maybe weekly streamer to flex position, a bit of a downgrade with all the targets that Adams is going to absorb. And I think that applies to Darren Waller, who you alluded to being on your team. I think he's still going to be a great fantasy player, but just not a game changer anymore. I think this separates Kelce and Andrews into a tier of their own at the top, and then you follow that with a second tier with Kittle and Waller. Joel, thoughts? Renfrow, Waller?
Yeah, they're both taking the hit, and unfortunately for myself, Waller will be slipping down, and that's a huge blow for my team name included, because he's now on the fence. Do I waste a keeper with someone that I know is not going to be as productive as he was? Didn't do so well for me last year, but injuries bear in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Hunter Renfrow picked up as of late, and I think he's going to be a key weapon in the slot with Davante Adams pulling coverage. So I assume he's going to continue with the strong presence he had at the end of last season into next.
Yeah, and that's the thing. When you add a player of Davante Adams' caliber, and this stems nicely into considering their running back, Josh Jacobs, too, the catches will come down for all of them, for Renfrow, for Waller, for Jacobs, much to fantasy players' despair. But the touchdowns and just the overall production of the offense should rise. And I think that makes all of these players at least rosterable at this point. And it's all up to you what you believe. Do you believe that it's the order of targets is going to go Davante Adams and then Renfrow? Do you believe it's going to go Davante Adams and then Waller? Do you think both of them are just going to be lower level assets to their teams or assets to fantasy football teams?
Yeah, and I think with the connection that Waller and Carr already had there, he's going to still be a big part of this offense, and I think he needs to be. But yeah, even with Bryan Edwards on the 3 slot, where's he going to fit in with this? So definitely changes things up this year for sure.
Yeah, I love that you saw the shout out in there. I have a shout out to Bryan Edwards. I loved him as a prospect coming in. He slipped to the 3rd round because of a pre-draft injury, and I thought, and along with many, that he could develop into a number 1 receiver. But I honestly think this is the end of the Bryan Edwards career in the drumbeat. He's not going to overcome Davante Adams for that position.
No.
And I think what you're saying here is perfect. I think what we're looking at for fantasy is we're looking at Davante Adams as that 1st or 2nd round draft pick, where you have to believe in the connection from college. You have to believe in the huge investment that they made. I think that Hunter Renfrow is off draft boards now, where he could have been a mid-round pick. You could take a late-round flyer on him. It could work out in the event of a Adams injury, but you're most likely looking at the top 2 passing options being Davante Adams, and then the check down or the alternative option being Waller. And then, like we said, Jacobs's catches were starting to go up. I think they're going back down, and I think that moves him into a lower tier himself in the running back.
Yeah,
position.
I think his Josh Jacobs stock took a bit of a hit with this one, and I think their game is going to be revamped this coming season, and we'll be running the ball less.
Absolutely. And to put a bow on this question's discussion, so Carr, as you noted, you were starting him last year, and I think that he remains a viable streamer, if not an actual weekly starter with all of these weapons. He's still probably not top 10. So I took the opportunity to kind of list my, not in order, but my sort of top 10 quarterbacks, where you've got Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow, Matt Stafford, Aaron Rodgers, Herbert, Kyler, Lamar, Dak, and even Jalen Hurts and his rushing ability. So there's 10 right there. And I don't think I'm putting Carr above any of these guys. So it's basically another situation similar to Tunyon, where if you miss out on the top 10, you can still have a viable option that can get you through the first few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. He's always been one I found that's kind of slipped under the radar, but rightfully so. Like he doesn't wow you with much, but he's a steady guy. But maybe that was because he never had someone like Davante Adams to bring him up to that next caliber of play.
Yeah. So, I mean, you heard it here first. If you think that Davante Adams is going to be that huge game-changing addition to the offense, and you like the combination with Waller and with Renfro and with Edwards and with Kenyon Drake, who we haven't really mentioned at this point as a pass-catching running back, and Josh Jacobs, then yeah, go with the, consistent 18 to 25 points with Derek Carr, and then maybe he'll surprise you and take off even further. And maybe you'll be able to upgrade later in the season with a trade or anything like that after Carr provides this sustainable and predictable mid-range production.
Yeah. And I just want to take some time here to point out, like, the AFC West and how it's looking right now, with the Raiders with a substantial upgrade with Adams. We have KC, who's got their weapons, but has taken a hit with Tyreek. The Broncos, as you talked last episode, with Russell Wilson, and then the Chargers, who've got a solid core with Herbert and Mike Williams and some other weapons on that team. Like, the AFC West is looking scary.
It is. And that's actually one of the better tips for fantasy football too. So, I mean, if you got your notepads out, jot this down, because you definitely want to look for those divisions where there's going to be shootouts. And looking at the AFC West, where they're playing each other twice a year, there's going to be some shootouts in there. So you want to get a piece of this division. It doesn't matter if it's Adams. You can go anywhere in these first 5 rounds and pick up any of these receivers, from Mike Williams to Keenan Allen to Davante Adams to Hunter Renfro very, very late in drafts, to Travis Kelce to Marquez Valdez-Scantling now with the Chiefs. I think you just want to get a piece, or a couple pieces even better, of these AFC West offenses.
There are some weapons in there for sure.
Yeah. And going to be lots of shootouts. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that fantasy gold. So now we're going to switch gears to the Rams. So they bring in Allen Robinson to be their light version of Davante Adams. And Allen Robinson is slated to complement wide receiver 1 Cooper Kupp, and who won the triple crown of receiving stats last year, with Matt Stafford being the new addition to the Rams offense. So, Joel, what are your thoughts on the Allen Robinson signing with the Rams?
This one caught me by surprise as well, because I had thought their lineup was already scary looking with Kupp, OBJ. There's some uncertainties there. Von Jefferson. So Allen Robinson, I would love him on my team, but he's going to fit in nice in that supporting role with Cooper Kupp. Their team is somehow looks better than last, in my opinion.
Yeah, it does. And so OBJ is still a free agent at the time of this recording. And like you said, it almost seemed like they were just ready to go. Like, I would have never imagined that they would trade Robert Woods, but I guess if you view Allen Robinson as an upgrade when you're trying to run it back, then you go for it. So you've got Kupp in the slot, and I think that he's going to have an amazing season again. And anybody who tells you that he's due for substantial regression doesn't know their stuff, but he'll probably regress. being the Triple Crown winner in receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, and receptions is not a feat that's replicable each year. But I think he's going to have another great year. And then, like you said, if you miss out on Kupp and you want a piece of this Rams offense, then you go Allen Robinson a little bit later, maybe in those mid rounds, and you assume that because they made this significant investment into him, he's going to be involved in the offense and he's going to be a viable wide receiver for fantasy. And before you jump back in here, Joel, too, I think that also is a death knell for the fantasy life there that is of Van Jefferson and probably Higbee as well at tight end.
Yeah, Vaughn is definitely taking a hit. Higbee as well, and I loved using Higbee here and there last year as just kind of a spot fill-in for bye weeks and injuries and such. But depending on the OBJ transactions, if it does, there's I think still a good chance he signs a hometown discounted deal to stay. Maybe Allen Robinson bringing him in will cause that to happen. But
yeah, absolutely. But
weapons on the floor for sure.
And in terms of maybe you're spooked. Last year, Allen Robinson finishes as the wide receiver 88. But as I mentioned, the rumor and the drumbeat is that Robinson was just OUT on the Bears experience. He was not having any of it. And he made a business decision. He mailed it in a little bit, and that may downgrade your view of him as a competitor. And I can't fault you for that. But what I can say is that now he's on a competitor that's guaranteed. They just won the Super Bowl. I think he's going to be motivated. I think he's going to be ready to go. And I think that this passing attack is consolidated to two players. And that's what we're looking for in fantasy, where we're talking about the Raiders. They have too many options, and it might be hard to decipher for fantasy. At least for fantasy for the Rams, it's the Kupp and Robinson experience.
Yes, and that duo is going to see the light of day. And with we'll call him a safety blanket of Robinson for when Kupp is getting doubled and things like that, he's going to be a force to be reckoned with and get you those extra touches.
Yeah, and I only laugh because even when Kupp is doubled, you might need to triple him at some point, and then maybe Allen Robinson is standing 20 yards down the field just waving his arms with no one around him.
Yeah.
So, and like I said, passing game, that's seeming like it's clear now, and we shift our attention to the running backs where it's not as clear. You've got guys like Cam Akers, Sony Michel, and Darrell Henderson. And while Akers is likely still the guy, it's at least a little cloudy. Joel, thoughts on the running back on the backfield there?
Yeah, I never like seeing three relatively solid names in the backfield. It leaves a lot of uncertainty for myself, and I believe Cam has that first spot out of the bag. But with Sony Michel and Darrell Henderson, it's how will they be used, how much, injuries. So big wild card in the backfield, and they may shut her down. Like, they have the weapons now in the wide receiving core to keep doing what they were doing last year.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that Higbee was usable. I think he's probably slotted into that area where he's a streamer. I don't think he's going to get drafted this year, but I mean, I couldn't fault you if you wanted to go back for more. He had an opportunity last year, but he didn't come through. So I would recommend not drafting him, but I couldn't fault you if you wanted to go down that road. And I think Stafford will yet again be fantasy gold. You mentioned the talk with Anthony last week. He went all in on Stafford in our draft last year, and I don't think that's a bad strategy again this year. We mentioned all the quarterbacks that are going to be available and that are going to be fantasy viable and even fantasy superstars coming up for this year. And I think Stafford has every right to be included in that group, especially with the addition of Robinson.
Yes, the production for Stafford is not going down this year compared to last. I think it's going to be increased coming off a Super Bowl, high expectations as well, but it's a good team.
Yeah, and you hit on a good point too. I think the only way that we could foresee that the production for Stafford goes down, I mean, part of it, obviously, if he gets injured, it goes right down. But
yes,
Also, as long as the Rams defense doesn't just completely start shutting teams down. And with Aaron Donald and their new addition, Bobby Wagner and Jalen Ramsey and Taylor Rapp all the way back to the secondary, it's possible, but you're right. They're going to be producing. They're going to be a high-powered offense. They've got Sean McVay. Let's go.
Yeah, even with their defense shutting the door, I think this high-powered offense would love to blow out any team 40-0 and keep pounding it to them. So I think there's going to be a lot of points coming off of this team.
Absolutely. And Joel, so I did rub it in that Jefferson is going to be a keeper on my team, but I mean, who owns Cooper Kupp?
Yeah, that would be myself. And you know what? I would take him over any of your keepers all day long.
What about a live trade? Your number one for your number two.
I'm going to have to shut that one down.
Almost had that Kupp Jefferson trade. That'll come.
Keep trying, pal.
Okay, so lastly, before my standard final question, we arrive at the trade that sends the ACL tear recovering Robert Woods to the Titans for a 2023 6th-round pick. Okay, let's pause here for a second. Indianapolis Colts, how did you not send a 6th-round pick to the Rams for Bobby Woods? Like, come on. We need a receiver. Anyways, I digress. Joel, I'm pretty heated about this deal, so might be best if you talk more here. Actually, and the deal occurred while we were watching an NHL alumni Stratford Firefighters game in Stratford, so you've had some time to ruminate on the deal. What do you think of the deal for the Titans and their fantasy players?
Yeah, well, diving into it a little bit more, you can see how it kind of makes sense with the Allen Robertson signing. To your point, why weren't the Colts trying for this? Perfect, but
which also applies to the rest of the league. Like a super productive player like Robert Woods for a 6th-round pick next year? Come on.
Yeah, I don't know how the Tennessee Titans did this, but they have a steal of a deal here for what they've gotten out of Woods. And as long as he can stay healthy and he's got a few, maybe 3-4 more productive years, it's going to pan out. But with AJ Brown now and Woods, Henry in the backfield, this team already was doing well last year. They've only gotten better.
Yeah, and I don't think we're going to end up spending too much time on this question too, because you're right. It's kind of perfectly set up. You got AJ Brown. He's a kind of a huge field stretcher that's maybe less efficient, akin to DK Metcalf, who they played together in college, Metcalf and Brown. This trade was for such little compensation, and it fills the role perfectly. And maybe the rest of the league got together at the league meetings that are occurring this week, and they were like, all right. I mean, and I guess this occurred prior to the league meeting, so might have to cut that part out. But maybe the rest of the league got together and they're like, yeah, they kind of overpaid for Julio last offseason, and everybody was real hyped about that. There were a lot of injuries, so maybe we just kind of give him this one. Let's give him Robert.
Yeah, I was a bust on the Julio Jones train there last year, so I was feeling that one, and I might have to jump to the Woods train here because I like what I see.
Yeah, he fills that reliable short to mid-range receiver role perfectly. Like we said, we got Brown stretching the field. He's very fast, very, very fast. And then Woods is that reliable 3rd down option that the Titans haven't had, much to my Colts love and fandom. That would really help them take it over the top. And like you mentioned, you got Woods should benefit from the attention of the return of King Henry. We got Derrick Henry coming back from his foot injury. Got to see a little bit of him with the playoffs. And I don't think Tannehill moving to their quarterback position, I don't think Ryan Tannehill can support 2 wide receiver 1s or 2 wide receiver 2s, but maybe you put Brown in the wide receiver 1 to 2 range, and then Woods in that sort of wide receiver 2 to 3 range where, like we said, with Robinson, or you're taking a flyer, ideally in the post round 7 range, 7, 8, 9 range, where you could take one of those middle round tight ends, but you could take a swing on Robert Woods and you could end up with a consistent, reliable fantasy asset that's soaking up those mid-range targets from Ryan Tannehill.
Yeah, and the Austin Hooper signing there in tight end's going to add some depth on their receiving core too. And I believe Julio Jones is leaving. Has there been any talk on that?
Yeah, no, it's actually funny. Julio Jones and AJ Green entered the NFL draft and the NFL in general in the same year. And now we're however many years into both of their careers, and they're both sitting as free agents with not a whisper to be heard. And that's essentially due to their injuries as these taller ex receivers who their body just seems to deteriorate much quicker than, let's say Chris Godwin, who's kind of the archetype for that's, flanker.
He still has breakout potential, but it's a big risk. I would advise to stay away from Julio this year if he ends up getting signed by another team.
Oh, absolutely. No, we're not falling for the AJ Green or Julio Jones hype again.
Yeah.
And neither should you as the audience. And yeah, you mentioned Austin Hooper signing at tight end. He was cut by the Browns after they tagged Njoku. That's cool. Hooper he might fall into that streaming sort of category if you believe that. And Tannehill does use the tight end position, so it's not a bad shot if you want to shoot your shot, but obviously maybe aim for those top tier tight ends. And then after that, you kind of just go with what you believe in.
Couldn't agree more.
So we arrive at our last question here, Joel. So who is a player in fantasy that you believe in that others may not or aren't aware of? Help our audience out. Let's illuminate one of these players for them.
You know what? I'm going to have to choose Jalen Waddle from the Miami Dolphins. So he's not unknown. I think this year.
Yeah, I'm going to have to call you out just like Anthony there. Just like calling out Eckler as a lesser known player. We'll give you the Waddle thing. We'll let you go, but then we're going to need another one.
Hey, if you miss football for 1 year, then you would have never heard of this guy. But
yep, that's true.
He had a great rookie season last year in Miami. Was their number one option. Now with the signing of Tyreek Hill, I think he's gonna fall under the radar, but he's not a guy to forget about. He's got breakout potential, quite fast, and that offense now has a few weapons. And if defenses decide to pick and choose, one of those are going to be open for some big gainers.
Yeah, and we last year with the Chiefs offense, we had the sort of invention or more attention back to that cover 2 shell defense where they took away Tyreek Hill as that top option, taking the lid off the defense. And you might even think as a fantasy manager that Tua can't get it all the way down there to Tyreek, and that all bodes extremely well for Jalen Waddle, who soaked up the receptions. And I think with both of their speed, I think it's going to be a huge benefit for both of them to kind of be those yards after catch yak monsters. That's what we're looking for. Tua gets them the ball and they just take off. And Jalen Waddle is famously the fastest player from the previous draft. And now you team up with Tyreek Hill, debatably the fastest player in the NFL, and we're flying.
No pun intended there.
Okay, so Joel, hit me with another one.
No. Yeah, so I would choose Marvin Jones. He's on that no-name list where I have a funny story for this one too. I think it was last year I was very close to changing my fantasy team name to Keeping Up with the Joneses because I had Marvin Jones, Julio Jones, Aaron Jones, and I was really close to picking up Daniel Jones just to get the 4 Joneses all on my team.
And Daniel Jones not a bad fantasy option. That could have been another one to call out here, where he's a good rushing quarterback, and he might actually have some fantasy value this year. So Joel hitting you with 3 of them here, but sorry, continue.
Yeah, so Marvin Jones never really has done anything star-studding, for lack of a better term. But he's been consistent the last 3 years, getting around 800 to 900 yards. There was no real threats on Jacksonville, and with Trevor Lawrence's first year last year and still putting up 9, I think he's got that in store for next year. They did add Christian Kirk from Arizona to Jacksonville, but I think, like we've mentioned, where having another name there is going to pull some coverage and leave you open for some burners.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, he's definitely going to be an option that's available later in the rounds. And I think with later round picks, one of the best pieces of advice that I ever received was to pick players that you're going to be able to see their involvement week one. And I think Jones is the perfect example. You get rid of the Urban Meyer experience, which proved to be a train wreck, which I absolutely loved from the Colts perspective. You get rid of Urban Meyer, and we kind of wipe the slate clean for Trevor Lawrence, because that was just a horrific offense. You bring in Christian Kirk so that the attention's not entirely all on Marvin Jones. You got Marvin Jones on one side, who's one of the best in the NFL at contested catches, if you don't already know that, audience. He really is. And then you have Kirk on the other side, maybe in the flanker role. And then you have a new addition in Evan Ingram. And then you have Etienne in the backfield and Robinson. And they still have a solid offensive line. So I don't see any reason why the Jags can't turn their franchise around, at least in terms of being somewhat sustainable for fantasy football production for the next coming year. And I think Joel hits on a great point where there is going to be two guys that emerge from this offense that are fantasy viable. And why couldn't it be Marvin Jones? Do we really expect, is it really more likely that Evan Ingram is the one that to pick up this sort of production? Or do we think it's at least possible that Marvin Jones could bounce back to or at least continue what he's been doing, where he's been fantasy relevant for the past few years?
Yeah, he's not going to blow you away by any means, but solid fill in here and there for some bye weeks. And if you run into injury trouble, that's for sure. Absolutely.
And then you have one injury on the Jags, and all of a sudden you got yourself some fantasy gold there.
Yes.
So let's call that a wrap. Thanks for coming, Joel. I appreciate your time, and I'm sure the listeners gained a lot of out of our conversation today, and I'm excited to see this pod hit the airwaves.
This has been great, Owen. I appreciate every minute of it, and I look forward to jumping back on here if I'm welcomed back after this. So this is great.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Joel.
Awesome.
Everybody, we're done here for today. You're going to want to listen to the next episode of the official 1-0 Fantasy Football Podcast. O-Dog, out.
Welcome to the outtakes. Can you find that unmute button? Famous last words. I muted you. Sorry. I'm gonna have another go at that first part just to.
Okay.
I'm letting the fantasy gods decide my fate tonight.
I'm the guy. In the end, the fantasy gods did not want that to happen.
Okay, let's go this again. We'll have the commish chair thing a little quieter because that was you're splitting again. I messed that up. I got to do that again.
Sorry, I kind of jumped in there too.
Yeah, no worries. We'll try that again. Prior to the 2021 fantasy season, the league of record is I can't hit this one right now.
Sorry, I thought yep.
This
is everything that team needed.
Where there may be a week to where their merit. We're going to have to put the volume down on that one as well.
Wow. I could have won. Yeah, I've shut off my phone's ringers. That should be good. I've told the dogs to shut up. So we'll see if they listen.
That was a bad time to take a mouthful of peanuts. Just getting a little hungry.
The end. Poof. Owen was gone.